Okay. Righto. Welcome to dis&datInformation 13 November. We're looking today at, rather than continuing on with David Harvey, which we were looking at yesterday. Essentially, Harvey, in the introduction to his book on madness and capitalism of 2017, Harvey essentially rehearses the usual reasons for doing things, and more specifically talks about motion, the motion of capitalism or movement in capitalism, and that's important. But we're going to take a slight detour, I suppose, and cellis bueno on attention. The text is the attention economy, labor, time, and power in cognitive capitalism. We're going to do the introduction, and we'll see how much farther we get, but I think we'll just be able to do the introduction. In a world in which information and knowledge become central to the valorization process of capital, human attention becomes a scarce and hence increasingly valuable commodity. In this new context, some authors belonging to the field of political economy have forged the notion of the attention economy in an attempt to explain the growing importance of human attention in societies characterized by post-industrial modes of production. These authors contend that the richer a society is in terms of its production, distribution, and consumption of information, the poorer it becomes in terms of human attention. Inventions such as the internet, email, databases, digital television, social media, and so on, together with the radical informatization of the process of production of commodities, have created both an abundance of information and a demand for new forms of organizing and allocating attention. Let me break here for a second. And this is the whole point that we've been looking at in a variety of other texts. It's not simply about labor, but it is the control of labor. And so organization and allocating attention is part of this idea that attention is one thing, and I think you can see it as a labor process. Well, we'll see. At the same back to the text. At the same time, critical studies in the field of communications have highlighted the fact that in post-industrial societies, paying attention becomes a new form of labor. Soot Jolly and Bill Levant in 1986, for example, suggests that media networks make a profit from capturing the audience's attention and then selling it to advertising agencies. This is this idea that the audience is commodity. From their perspective, the audience appears as an active agent in the production of surplus value, and human attention can thus be conceived as productive labor. Similarly, Jonathan Beller, 2006, contends that with the massification of the internet, the attention of users becomes a new territory of capitalist exploitation, which alienates the spectator from his or her own vision. Now, that requires a little bit more work, I suppose. By clicking like on Facebook or searching for a term on Google, the attention of each user is being translated into a new form of knowledge that is then utilized by corporations and advertising agencies to make a profit. In doing so, the attention economy shifts the limit between productive and unproductive labor, and hence broadens capital's command over life. Remember, I was talking about that control and command and control over life to include not only labor time, but also leisure time. This is that business of the difference between paid and unpaid, right? Marazzi of 2008. Using a Marxist theoretical framework, these critical accounts of the attention economy suggest that these critical accounts of the attention economy suggest that attention must be understood not only as a valuable commodity, but mainly as a laboring activity, which, although not necessarily grounded on abstract labor time, well, I think you could actually argue that, nevertheless involves clearly exploitation and power relations, clearly being social as communication is. Using a series of contemporary readings of Marx, Pastone of 1993, Lazzarato of 96, Hart and Negri 2000, Deleuze and Guattari 2004, this book develops a systematic critique of the attention economy. Unlike previous attempts to do so, however, this work will not simply apply Marxist categories to the object of the attention economy, but will use the attention economy as a concrete object of analysis for reflecting upon both the validity and the importance of Marx's critique of political economy for critique of contemporary capitalism. The concept of attention economy was first introduced by Herbert A. Simon in his 1969 lecture, Designing Organizations for an Information-Rich World. During the decade of the 1960s, economists were deploying notions such as knowledge and information in an attempt to explain the crisis of industrial capitalism and the radical changes triggered by it. In these emergent post-industrial societies, purely industrial processes were no longer seen as the single source of value. Instead, knowledge and information were becoming central aspects of the economic cycle, reshaping the way in which surplus value is produced and exploited. This new post-industrial mode of production is usually referred to in political economy as knowledge capitalism or knowledge-based economy. Simon's definition of the attention economy has to be understood as a response to this new economic context. Oh, bloody hell. Damn it. According to Simon, in the emerging post-industrial economies, it is not only knowledge and information that becomes central to the productive process, but also the attention necessary to process this knowledge and this information. Using straightforward supply and demand logic, Simon argues that the abundance of knowledge and information that characterizes knowledge-based economies creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate the attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. In this new productive scenario, the most pressing economic question becomes, how can we design organizations, business firms, and government agencies to operate effectively in such a world? How can we arrange to conserve and allocate effectively their scarce attention? With this question, Herbert A. Simon inaugurates a new field of economic analysis, the attention economy, footnote 2. Despite being introduced in 1969, it wasn't until, and this is problematic in and of itself, wasn't until the 1990s that the attention economy became widely accepted and discussed. In particular, it was with the invention of the internet and the massification of digital technologies that human attention became a pressing topic in economic analyses. In 1997, Michael H. Goldhaber applied Simon's definition of the attention economy to explain the emerging economic possibilities of the internet. Like Simon, Goldhaber argues that in a society in which information and knowledge become central to the productive process, the attention necessary to grasp and set to work all that information and knowledge efficiently becomes equally crucial. Accordingly, the more knowledge and information we have access to, the scarcer a resource attention becomes. Goldhaber's novel approach, however, seeks to displace Simon's conceptualization of attention economy to a specific object of focus, that is, the internet. He argues that the internet is not only abundant, but overflowing with information. At the same time, he states, there is something else that moves through the net, flowing in the opposite direction from information, namely attention. The vast volume of information made available by the internet turns attention into an intrinsically scarce, quote unquote, and therefore valuable resource. In addition to this, Goldhaber suggests that the internet is a privileged territory for the exchange of this valuable commodity. Now, this is due to at least two reasons. First, its capacity to generate and distribute information in audio-visual form, that is a combination of texts, images, sounds, videos, etc., turns the internet into an appealing platform to capture attention, footnote 3. Second, the internet provides extremely powerful mechanisms for measuring the attention it captures and hence creating and cultivating segmented and specialized audiences. Let me break here for a second. The audience, in that sense, is the commodity. And back to the text. Unlike more traditional media, such as television, radio, and printed media, the internet provides instant analysis tools that offer rich feedback for measuring attention and manufacturing personalized audiences. Since Goldhaber's first attempt to think of the internet through Simon's definition of attention as a scarce commodity, the attention economy has become an important theoretical framework for explaining the rapid monetization of internet-based corporations. Today, more than 15 years after Goldhaber's article was published, it seems very difficult to address the issue of the attention economy, be it from a purely economic point of view or from a critical perspective, without referring to the internet as one of its main objects of analysis. Still, it is important to note that the discourse on the attention economy is far from constituting a mainstream trend within the field of economics. In spite of this, the current economic boom of internet corporations such as Google, Facebook, YouTube, and so on, together with the massification of personal computers and smartphones, the growth in internet access, and the rise in the average time spent online, are gradually turning the concept of attention economy into a symptomatic phenomenon of contemporary capitalism. In Tiziana Terranova's words, quote, "It is true that some theories that is, economic theories on the attention economy, such theories constitute a kind of fringe discourse within the field of economics at large, and one that lacks the legitimacy that is usually granted to more academic work, published mostly on the internet and then occasionally translated into paperback publications for the market of incumbent and inspiring internet entrepreneurs. They constitute a specific genre, which, while also being somehow ephemeral, in some ways translates what are the most general preoccupations of economic actors operating within the context of what used to be called the new economy. Close quote. In particular, with the emergence of what has been called the Web 2.0, and more recently with the notion of big data, the attention of users becomes both a desired commodity and a generous source of value. The main characteristic of the Web 2.0 is that the internet does not operate as a unidirectional medium of communication, but as a platform. That is, an apparatus in which most of the content is simultaneously generated, shared, and consumed by the users themselves. Footnote 4. In this sense, users do not play a merely passive role as consumers of information, but are active participants in the constitution of the web's content. Furthermore, with the improvement of data processing algorithms, what is known today as big data, users' attention itself becomes the valuable content generated by the internet. As Matteo Pasquinelli notes, big data is not simply defined by a change of degree, that is, big data meaning more data, but by a qualitative leap from information to meta-information, or, as you might imagine, information about information. In this context, the internet becomes a thriving platform where human attention is not only the target of information, that is, how many eyeballs consume a given advertising message, but an average source of information about consumers' habits and preferences. Matteo Pasquinelli describes this shift as follows. Oh, damn it. Sorry. Shit. At the same time, however, the apologetic literature of the attention economy fails to grasp the exploitative nature of these phenomena, concealing the asymmetric power relations that ground the production, distribution, and consumption of knowledge and information. So there is a failure, and there's literature on this, but it doesn't quite address the issue of how exploitation occurs, or, as it were, the extraction of value, I suppose. Anyway, back to the text. The cognitive capitalism hypothesis. As a response to the theoretical shortcomings of political economy, some authors have suggested that it is necessary to understand knowledge-based economics as a strictly capitalist phenomenon based on the asymmetric struggle between capital and living labor. For Carlo Vericellone, for example, although it remains true that the contemporary historical conjuncture is marked by the diffusion and the ever more central role of knowledge in the organization of production and the dynamic of technical progress, it is also true that theories of knowledge capitalism have developed an approach that often abstracts from the capital-labor antagonism and from the conflicts of knowledge and power which structure transformations in the division of labor. For this reason, Vericellone argues it is necessary to develop a critical response to knowledge capitalism, which highlights both the persistence of the capital labor struggle in contemporary society and the growing importance of cognitive activities for the valorization process of capital. Yes, we're back there again. Versalone calls this critical response the cognitive capitalism hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that knowledge and technical progress alone are the moving cause behind the mutations of capitalism. It suggests that the knowledge and technical progress alone are the moving cause behind the mutations of capitalism. Instead, the cognitive capitalism hypothesis claims that knowledge-based economies are the result of the we're right there, subsumption of knowledge and information to the laws of capitalist accumulation. That is, that the rise of post-industrial capitalism is a direct consequence of the internal contradictions of capitalism and not a consequence of technical progress. And I think that makes perfect sense. And of course, there are other issues at work. All right, back to the text. Echoing Versalone, Molière-Boutin points out that the analysis of cognitive capitalism must not forget that despite its radical transformations of the productive processes, cognitive capitalism remains a capitalist mode of organizing production. This means that cognitive capitalism is not a mode of production oriented towards the production, valorization, and accumulation of knowledge for knowledge's sake, but rather a mode of production in which knowledge becomes an active element for the production, valorization, and accumulation of capital. So already, it's not about Department 1. It is Department 1 and 2 in that sense, or the moment at which, you get to valorization. Anyway, Versalone and Boutin's argument are focusing on the specific object of the attention economy. As mentioned above, the concept of attention economy develops initially as part of the theories of knowledge capitalism. As such, the concept focuses on the importance of human attention within a context in which knowledge and information become key aspects of the productive process. At the same time, however, as such, the concept focuses on the importance of human attention within a context in which knowledge and information become key aspects of the productive process. At the same time, however, the concept of attention economy fails to grasp the asymmetric power relations that ground the production of value in contemporary capitalism, precisely because it treats human attention as a commodity rather than as an active element of the capital-labor antagonism. I don't think it's quite, yes, I suppose it is. It's reified in that sense. Hence, political economy is unable to see that the attention economy constitutes a concrete mechanism for exploiting unpaid labor, generating surplus value from the harvesting of consumer preferences, interests, and habits. So this is one an example. Let me break here for a second. The example, of course, are the databases that come from offering you discounts on goods in your supermarket, for example, if you join their participation program, their digital participation program at one level or another, where you get, tiny discounts on various things during the week, or there's a loss leader or some other kind of thing. The conceptual shift from attention as a scarce commodity to attention as a new form of labor has allowed authors such as Sut Jolly and Bill Levon and Jonathan Beller to argue that in contemporary capitalism, human attention becomes an active mechanism of capitalist exploitation. Beller, for example, suggests that the attention economy gathers human attention through complex algorithms that create patterns about consumption habits, preferences, lifestyles, and so on, turning this information into an active element of the valorization cycle of capital. So we're right back, in the bosom of the critique of political economy. In this sense, the attention economy becomes a new form of labor that expands the capitalist exploitation of surplus value beyond factory walls, and thereby blurs the distinction between labor time and leisure time, and between labor space and leisure space. Noting, of course, that this is, a somewhat arbitrary division, and that, with the advent of smartphones, our attention can even be drawn to that while at work, which, in some areas of activity can actually cause accidents and, mayhem. In other words, the attention economy appears as a concrete apparatus aimed at the reproduction of capital's capacity to impose its command over human activity. So we're filling in the instrumental elements of the issue of control and command over labor by capital, motivated by the belief that today, no less than in earlier times, Marx's work remains the most ambitious and systematic theoretical attempt to analyze capitalist society. These authors deploy Marxist terminology using concepts such as alienation, exploitation, necessary and surplus labor time, etc., as a way to examine the concrete mechanisms through which the attention economy exploits human attention. So there's a move there, right? Footnote 5. Most notably, Beller tries to define an attention theory of value that would modernize Marx's labor theory of value in order to explain how human attention becomes an active source of surplus value. For Beller, the attention economy represents a generalized alienation of the spectator from his or her vision, in the same way that capitalism denotes an alienation of the worker from his or her labor. It's problematic, of course, because, how can you alienate spectator from vision in that same way? Is that, homologous or whatever? Anyway, as it will be shown in chapter 1, the main theoretical shortcoming of these critical responses is their lack of historical specificity when applying Marxist terminology to the particular object of the attention economy. Contrary to this, the present work raises the question of the validity of Marx's critique of political economy for an adequate analysis of the attention economy. From this perspective, this book belongs to the broader literature that reflects upon the validity of Marx's critique of capitalism for understanding the contemporary world. Footnote 6. In the specific case of the attention economy, the reflection regarding the validity of Marx's theory involves posing at least 3 questions. Number 1, to what degree is the attention economy a specific form of capitalist production? Number 2, in what sense does the attention economy differ from the industrial mode of production in which Marx developed his critique of capitalism? And 3, how can Marx's theory be used today, despite the historical differences that separate industrial from post-industrial capitalism? This book argues that the attention economy remains a capitalist mode of production because its overarching aim is the accumulation of capital, and because this accumulation is based on the asymmetric power relations between capital and living labor. Just as the cognitive capitalism hypothesis unveils the capitalist nature of knowledge-based economies, the attention economy has to be understood above all as a capitalist phenomenon. At the same time, however, the way in which the accumulation of capital and the asymmetric power relation between capital and living labor are played out in the specific post-industrial context of the attention economy differ greatly from the mechanisms of production, accumulation, exploitation of value described by Marx in his critique of 19th century capitalism. The aim of this work, then, is to explore these differences and power entailed in the passage from industrial to post-industrial capitalism. It attempts a reinterpretation of certain aspects of Marx's critique of political economy, namely its labor theory of value. Yes, there we are again, and can contribute to advancing the critique of the present stage of capitalist production. To achieve this, the attention economy functions as an exemplary object of investigation. The book suggests that although the attention economy has indeed turned human attention into a new form of labor, it is only through a systematic rentier reinterpretation of Marx's categories that this claim can be fully grasped. Systematic reinterpretation of Marx's categories. This reinterpretation comprises two general aspects. On the one hand, the way in which the attention economy produces and exploits value demands questioning the traditional category of labor based on an industrial mode of production, and which reifies solely on abstract labor time as its general equivalent. On the other hand, the attention economy demands a examination of the way in which capital reproduces the command over human activity, that is, the way in which capital reproduces a specific set of power relations. So you can see it is about system, it is systematic, it is this idea of reinterpretation, does fit into the notion of, sort of the laws of motion that we're talking about, that, maybe in the first moment that doesn't happen, but it probably happens in the second moment in terms of capital circulation. Anyway. Following these two considerations, I argue that the attention economy belongs to a general shift of capitalism in which subjectivity itself gradually becomes the territory of production and exploitation of value, as well as the territory of reproduction of capitalist power relations. In this context, subjectivity is understood not simply as the seat of intellectual operations, but also as the affective and libidinal forces that weave together a world. That is, attentiveness, the ability to address, care for, and appeal to others. Post-industrial capitalism is characterized by replacing large portions of manual labor with automated machines. Nevertheless, post-industrial capitalism continues to exploit the more generic attitudes of the mind, that is, the faculty of language, the disposition to learn, memory, the capacity to abstract and relate, and the inclination towards self-reflexivity. It's Verno, 1996. In other words, post-industrial capitalism takes the mind, language, and creativity as its primary tools for the production of value. It's Bernardi, 2009, Hart and Negri, 1999, called this shift towards subjectivity affective labor. While Berardi, 2009, refers to it as the quote unquote, the soul at work. The important aspect of this phenomenon, as Virno suggests, is that by putting subjectivity itself to work, capitalism renders the impersonal technical division of labor spurious, but also induces a vicious personalization of subjection. So that's an interesting problem and raises an important issue that we will probably have to get back to, this idea of that is kind of projection as well. Anyway, in this new context, it is subjectivity itself, that disposition to thought and action, which is now under the command of capital. This study makes an effort to provide the necessary conceptual tools for understanding the gradual shift towards subjectivity that characterizes both contemporary capitalism as a whole and the attention economy in particular. Furthermore, it argues that an immanent approach, we're back to Kant again, right? Immanent approach represents the most adequate methodology for such an enterprise. So, towards an immanent critique. The notion of immanent critique has to be understood as a specific form of critique that does not rely on any external standpoint when examining its object. Rather, an immanent critique focuses on the contradictions that are internal to its object of analysis. It has been argued, Bastone 1993, that Marx's critique of political economy is undertaken from an immanent standpoint, which attempts to unveil the core contradictions of capitalism. Now, according to this interpretation, Marx's critique is not a critique of capitalism from the transhistorical standpoint of labor, but a critique of labor as a historically specific capitalist category, Pastone 1993. This means that Marx's critique is not a universally applicable theory, but a critical theory limited strictly to the capitalist mode of production. So, it's not universal? Is it more particular? Is it particular itself? Or is it even more singular, as they say? Anyway, in the case of the attention economy, an immanent critique could neither be a normative assessment of the benefits or disadvantages of digital technologies for contemporary society, nor a historicist account of the transformation of our modes of production. Footnote 7. An immanent critique of the attention economy must unravel the internal contradictions that the concept itself presupposes. See, there's a reflexivity built into this. It is important to note that the insistence on such a methodology is given by the object itself in a context in which every human activity becomes a potential source of surplus value. The capital labor struggle begins to take place in what Hart and Negri, 1999, have called a non-place of exploitation. In this non-place, the measure of labor value grounded on the independence of use value becomes ineffectual, and the relation between living labor and capital becomes one of immediate, naked command. To develop a critique adequate to this context, Hart and Negri argue one must quote, refuse the temptation to go on a simple path that is presented to us, the path of reintroducing the Marxian figures of use value and pretending to renovate them in the context of this new situation. How do the philosophers and politicians who situate themselves in this perspective, how do they proceed? They reconstruct a fictional use value that they nostalgically oppose to globalization, a humanistic resistance. They oppose to globalization a humanistic resistance. In reality, in their discourse, they bring to light again all the values of modernity and use values configured in terms of identity. Even when use value is not invoked explicitly, it ends up being inserted surreptitiously. Close quote. Hart and Negri. Now, what Hart and Negri denounce as the main flaw of contemporary Marxist critiques of capitalism is the lack of an immanent methodology. That is, a methodology that avoids the temptation to smuggle in an external ahistorical perspective, which in turn would reintroduce a humanistic framework. Now, that's an important assertion and one that is obviously a critique of the 1960s, 70s, sort of project for humanist Marxism. Back to the text, in the critical literature on the attention economy and the new forms of digital labor, this flaw has become a recurring trait. Authors such as Jolly and Levant and Beller presuppose in one way or another that human attention possesses a use value that is alienated by capital. Now, the problem with this way of proceeding is not only a lack of historical specificity, but the fact that it necessarily leads to a normative reading of Marx's critique of capitalism. So, Nick Dyer Whitford, come on. Nick Dyer Whitford and Christian Fuchs, for example, claim that Marx's own works are grounded on normative judgments that both condemn capitalism as an oppressive, exploitative, alienating, estranging, and heteronymous, and also present an alternative vision of a better world. Therefore, these authors state a Marxist critique of the internet necessarily entails a normative judgment that examines its role in the struggles for emancipation. As will be argued, the main limitation of a normative project is that it requires an external standpoint. This is, standpoint theory writ large. Labor, freedom, individuality, use value, etc., from where to undertake such a critique. Against such a view, this work follows Bastone's interpretation of Marx in order to suggest that Marx's mature works are not merely a normative critique of capitalist society, but a systematic analysis of its internal contradictions. So this is trying to describe, that kind of moment, the moment with the movement, the kind of valorization process, the overlap or the intersection of Department 1 and Department 2 in that sense. So it describes, some kind of circulatory logic. According to Marx, back to the text, according to Marx, capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as sole measure and source of wealth. This constitutes the internal limit of capitalism, It puts forth an enormous technological and scientific revolution that aims at reducing the amount of labor time necessary for the production of each commodity to a minimum, while at the same time it uses labor time as the universal measure to preserve a given social order based on value and on the capacity of capital to command human activity. So it has this kind of two ideas. The attention economy must be understood as a consequence of this contradiction under post-industrial conditions of production. So, on the one hand, the attention economy is the result of an enormous technical revolution that employs information technologies in an effort to orchestrate the production, distribution, and consumption of commodities. On the other hand, the attention economy subsumes the unleashed social productivity under the logic of surplus value, expanding the exploitation of human activity beyond the factory and hence reproducing the dominant power relations on a larger scale. Now, I don't know how, I suppose there are examples. You could argue, and I'm not going to argue this necessarily, but that's the problem with ICE agents, particularly those who really aren't ICE agents, but who are those who wish to become them or use it as a subterfuge to rob people or rape them, etc. So anyway, back to the text. In this book, I attempt to unveil how these contradictions manifest in specific concepts of labor, time, and power. In the case of labor, an imminent critique of the attention economy cannot merely argue that attention becomes a new form of labor without examining the historical mutations of this category. Hence, an imminent critique must address the historicity of the category of labor and focus on how the specific transformations put forth by post-industrial capitalism have produced the conditions of possibility for attention to become a new source of surplus value. So, specific transformations under post-industrial capitalism, they produce conditions of possibility possibility for attention to become a new source of surplus value. Now, you want to think about, well, now what does that mean? I mean, how is it that you can cleave off surplus labor and from that surplus value? Accordingly, a critique of the attention economy from the perspective of time cannot simply oppose a human non-technical time to a cyber time, as if the former were a transcendental framework, non-technical time, a transcendental framework from where to evaluate the detrimental effects of the latter. This kind of idea that, certain things can or must be exogenous in that particular idea context. Rather, back to the text, rather an examination of the temporality of the attention economy should highlight the fact that human time is always the result of a technical process of exteriorization. That is, from this perspective, both clock time and cyber time appear as two ways in which human activity is subsumed under capital, which at the same time correspond to two different forms of generating surplus value. Finally, in the case of the analysis of attention as a power apparatus, this study attempts to overcome any concept of society based on a transhistorical definition of the individual, for example, a fully formed subject that uses or is used by digital technologies. The transhistorical definition of the individual. Instead, It follows Deleuze and Guattari's social theory, according to which society is the result of an immanent organization of flows, that is, flows of desire, flows of bodies, flows of codes, an immanent organization of flows. To analyze the internal contradictions between the deterritorializing and re-territorializing drives that constitute contemporary capitalism. So you have, on the one hand, spatial annihilation, when one deterritorializes something, and yet there is a kind of necessary, dialectical, I suppose, re-territorializing drive. Anyway, furthermore, it examines how this contradiction triggers the historical transformation of the dominant diagram of power through which society is organized. Page 11, Introduction, Chapter Outline. This book is composed of 5 chapters, each of which explores the phenomenon of the attention economy from the perspective of one central concept. Labor was, it's one central concept that consists of labor, value, time, machines, and power. Chapter 1 uses Marxist distinction between labor power and the labor process in order to show that the attention economy does not only constitute a scarce commodity, but also an emerging form of labor, that is a new valorization activity. So this is important, that there is no, is there or is there not one valorization, because we are moving towards a kind of abstraction, can we claim that there are new valorization activities? But anyway, using Jolly and Livant's seminal article on the topic, the chapter sets the basic theoretical framework for understanding how human attention can generate surplus value, and how this surplus is exploited by media networks. At the same time, however, Chapter 1 suggests that the main shortcoming of the critiques of the attention economy from the standpoint of labor is their tendency to universalize, yes, that Hegel thing again, tendency to universalize a certain notion of labor, thus neglecting its historical specificity. This is that continuing problem that we see in the other literature, that at some moment this kind of transhistorical move occurs somehow. Following Postone's 1993 reinterpretation of Marx, the chapter shows that a critical theory of capitalism in general, and of the attention economy in particular, must not be a critique, quote unquote, from the standpoint of labor, but an imminent critique of the notion of labor as a strictly capitalist category, i.e., human activity measured in terms of abstract value. And in some ways, you can make that argument without a lot of anyway. Accordingly, a critique of the attention economy cannot limit itself to the standpoint of labor, but must address the specific changes in the labor-value relation, labor-value relation, that have created the conditions of possibility for attention to become a valorization activity. Chapter 2 attempts to contextualize the attention economy within the Marxist problematic of the labor-value relation, using mainly the work of some Italian post-Marxist authors, that is, Alquati, Lazzarato, and Negri, this chapter contends that the social and technical transformations put forth by post-Fordism demand a radical reinterpretation of the opposition between living labor and machines, which informs Marx's labor theory of value. The chapter uses Alquati's concept of valorization information and Lazzarato's concept of immaterial labor to examine the concrete mechanisms through which the attention economy becomes a new source of surplus value. In doing so, it provides a historical account of the labor value relation, which challenges the traditional Marxist understanding of exploitation. From Negri's perspective, labor becomes disentangled. Labor becomes disentangled from a strict value relation and appears as a power apparatus aimed at the reproduction of capitalist power relations. Now, this shift, now the point, of course, is there's a shift, but is it a break? I think it's important to think of this in slightly different ways. All right, this shift marks a significant step towards an imminent critique of the attention economy, since it enables understanding of the attention economy not only as a new form of labor, but mainly as a concrete power apparatus whose function is to reproduce a given social order. So there's a structural implication here, right? This general shift from economics to the analysis of power relations sets the ground for the critique of the attention economy developed in the remaining chapters. Chapter 3 argues that there is a constitutive relationship between temporality and power that characterizes the attention economy. Using Bernard Stiegler's theory of originary technicity, and his concept of cinematic time, this chapter challenges the opposition between a living time of labor and a dead time of technical machines. So, are we simply revisiting fixed or constant values as opposed to, variable stuff? Anyway, in Stiegler's view, living time is always the result of an ongoing process of technical exteriorization. This places technicity at the heart of the production of temporality, unveiling the interrelation between dead technical memory and living memory. In this regard, Chapter 3 allows for a more appropriate conceptualization of the organic composition of capital for the specific context of post-industrialization, which does not simply oppose human time and technical time, but that which grasps the interrelation that mutually defines them. So we're all the way back to the thing, you can't ever sort of pin it down. It's always dynamic in that sense. It moves back and forth or circulates. It's a circuit, right? A multiple set of circuits. To develop this argument, Chapter 3 examines Stiegler's hypothesis regarding the political consequences of the massification of digital technologies and the subsequent industrialization of memory and attention. That should be interesting. Stiegler contends that the massification of digital technologies creates an industrialization of consciousness. That's an interesting turn of phrase. A systematic loss of individuation and a ruin of narcissism that undermines the very moving force that keeps capitalist consumption alive. In this regard, this chapter connects the problems of temporality to those of power and desire. Chapter 3 ends by outlining the theoretical shortcomings of Stigler's theory for a critique of the relations between temporality and power in the attention economy. So, despite its So despite its novel theory of time and its contribution to advancing a reconceptualization of the big topic, or organic composition of capital in a post-industrial context, Stigler's insistence on the phenomena of individuation and normalization turns his analysis of the attention economy into an obsolete framework more suitable to industrial than to post-industrial capitalism. Chapter 4 continues the analysis of the attention economy from the standpoint of power. This chapter uses Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's concept of machine labor in order to show how the attention economy operates as a concrete power mechanism aimed at re-territorializing the productive forces unleashed by post-Fordism. The chapter begins by introducing Deleuze and Guattari's social theory, according to which every society is a specific organization of flows of desire. In particular, it focuses on these authors' definition of capitalism from the standpoint of the twofold movement of deterritorialization and re-territorialization. On the one hand, this chapter argues that Deleuze and Guattari's reading of Marx offers a novel interpretation of the relation between labor, value, and technology that resembles that of Apparismo, right? Italian post-Marxism examined in chapter 2. Most significantly, Deleuze and Guattari set forth an imminent analysis of post-industrial capitalism, which puts into question the distinction between living labor and machines. So, on the other hand, these authors go beyond Italian post-Marxism by introducing a radical notion of machines as desiring machines. This gets into, Freud, etc. For Deleuze and Guattari, there is no difference in nature, quote unquote, between social and technical machines, but only a difference in the, quote unquote, regimes that govern them. That's certainly possible. This means that the real difference is not between technical, organic, and social machines, but rather between the molecular level of desiring machines and the molecular and molar level, where technical, social, and organic machines appear as separate entities. For this reason, Chapter 4 concludes that the opposition between living labor and technical machines must be replaced with an imminent analysis of the legitimate and illegitimate uses of the synthesis of desiring machines. Whoa. So, does this reduce to the, as it were, the televisual? That's an interesting question. From this perspective, the attention economy appears as a mechanism of re-territorialization aimed at the reproduction of an illegitimate use of the syntheses of desiring machines. In other words, the attention economy reterritorializes post-Fordism's deterritorialized words. The attention economy reterritorializes post-Fordism's deterritorialized flows of desire and labor in order to reproduce capital's command over life. That's a long way to go. Chapter 5 carries on the analysis from Chapter 4 by arguing that the attention economy is a concrete power apparatus that must be understood as a result of the passage from disciplinary society to a control society sketched by Deleuze in 1995. As such, the attention economy responds to the mutations of labor characteristics of post-industrial societies. The chapter begins by outlining the general characteristics of the shift from disciplinary society to control societies, and contends that the attention economy is an exemplary object to illustrate this transformation. That is, transformation from the disciplinary to the control. To develop this point, Chapter 5 compares the role of attention in disciplinary societies as outlined in Foucault's analysis of the panopticon and the role of attention in the specific context of cognitive capitalism. And I think you can see where he's going with this. By contrast, in controlled societies, attention becomes a source of information about the behavior of a broader object of power, that is, the population. This means that the attention economy does not aim at the normalization of a mass of individuals, as Stiegler suggests. Rather, the attention economy turns human attention into a new source of information about a given population, hence transforming this new object of power into an economically manageable body. So, I don't know, survey research, polling, maybe? I don't know, it just whatever. In this sense, this chapter concludes that in the attention economy, the mass/individual dyad characteristic of the disciplinary society dissolves and is replaced gradually by the notions of individuals and markets. I guess that's Deleuze and Guattari. The concluding section of Chapter 5 uses Deleuze and Guattari's concepts of machine enslavement and social subjection in an attempt to bring together the main arguments presented throughout this book. So let me break for a moment and say, there's a lot there. The notes are actually kind of interesting as well, which I commend to you. But these are interesting ideas because we do need to ask a further social science-like question, and that is, can immanence be measured in that sense? So anyway, that's the question. Not that that's an answer. I've gone a little bit, couple minutes over time, and so therefore, I shall go back to the meeting, noting what we've been doing here, and stop the live stream and stop the share. Thank you very much for your attention. We may or may not do Chapter 2 or Chapter 1, actually, of this text tomorrow.